Oh no, I totally did Instagram. It was really nice, and also like really there was yeah. I was like really. Oh, you needed to be prepared. Because you were like, yeah. But yeah, now whatever. I mean. Anyway, like it was really nice, but also like I like you guys natural vacations. Got to like be here. I have been thinking about my camping this weekend. Yeah, I was someone from church that, yeah, they like made a reservation and had a ball, and then I'd gone.
I'm gonna borrow your microphone here. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for coming. What a great crowd. Thank you for spending your Friday evening here at Lost City Books. For those of you who don't know, my name is Shady. I'm the events coordinator here. And if you're brand new to Lost City Books, we are a used, new, and rare bookstore, and we specialize in a very carefully curated selection of really cool books by really cool people. And if you have met any of our staff, you know we're a bunch of weirdos. Cell phones out of respect to our speakers this evening. You may take some photos and videos as per our speaker's permission. So if you want to do that, you may. Yeah, so that's what we don't want. Additionally, this event is being live streamed. None of you are currently on camera, but if you, towards the end of the event when we have our Q&A, if you choose to ask a question, that question will be on the live stream, just so you know. If you purchase your book ahead of time via Eventbrite, just come let me know at the end and I'll make sure that you get the book that's assigned to you. If you didn't buy your book in advance, well, you know, good luck because these are gonna fly off the shelves, I'm definitely sure. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome our two speakers for the evening. If you two want, also you can remove your masks to do this talk. That's up to you. Yeah. Rachel E. Gross Fellow and digital science editor of the Smithsonian Magazine. She writes for Time and Scientific American. Welcome, Rachel. Dr. Nasreen Ghazi is a family medicine physician with expertise in obstetrics. I've never been able to pronounce that properly, and a passion for women's health. She spent 7 years practicing and teaching at the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine and is currently a physician in student health at Florida Atlantic University. She's a mom of 3 who enjoys knitting, watercolor painting, and practicing martial arts in her free time. Wow. And with welcome both of our speakers.
Thank you so much for having us at the bookstore today. It is a really cute bookstore. And thank you so much, because I really enjoyed the book. And speaking of the book, if you don't mind reading a little bit, I think there was a passage that we were hoping to kind of start up the discussion on.
I would be glad to. Thank you everyone for coming. You are the Clitorati tonight.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Ghazi. So I just read a little tiny passage that I think gets at some of the themes of the book. So one of the questions I found myself asking scientists most often as I reported this was, why has it taken until now for science to investigate insert obvious thing? For example, what makes a healthy vaginal ecosystem? How does the menstrual cycle actually work? What is the G-spot really? And in response, I always heard some version of the phrase, you can't see what you aren't looking for, or you see what you expect to see. In many ways, this book is about different ways of looking. Science is done by scientists. They live in their own eras, in their own skin. They look at the world not only through microscopes and telescopes, but through their own limited human lens. And for most of human history, these scientists have been Western, white, and male. They were shaped by the attitudes and politics of their time, and the knowledge they produced in turn reinforced and perpetuated these politics. Throughout history, this scientific knowledge has been used to silence some and privilege others, to decide which bodies were worthy and which were not. I hope this book can illuminate the blinders that limited what those early anatomists saw, to challenge the idea that what they produced was objective knowledge, to show that beyond that horizon, there was more to see and know. When these men looked at women, they often peered through a lens of reproduction. Women were walking wombs, baby machines, sexual difference. Today, a new generation is thinking outside this box. They're looking at those organs most found up in reproduction, the uterus, ovaries, and vagina, and seeing them as part of a larger whole, as being dynamic, active, and resilient, as a window into more universal processes like healing and regeneration. You can't imagine what you can't see, but you also can't see what you can't imagine. The people and discoveries in this book are a testament to what we can see if we imagine differently. And I will just mention that I didn't get the nuance of language there, but I talk about women in many different ways, but this book includes trans women, non-binary people, and intersex people, and basically anyone with anatomy relevant to the organs we're talking about.
So, actually, I kind of want to talk about that because by the way, she, her assigned. So as a physician who treats patients in college health, and I actually found that idea where you talk about the reproductive organ system of females, like the female reproductive system. When I'm talking to patients, I find that is a little bit hard for me because I do have patients who are trans men. And to say that to them, this is the reproductive, female reproductive system. Did you find kind of in your readings or kind of just in your experience that there's a better term for me as a physician to use or for people to use?
I am on that journey as well. But yeah, I definitely, that's so interesting to hear from someone who uses it in a practical sense every day with patients. Because as I was going throughout this book, I was like, wait, there's a problem with both female and reproductive here. Reproductive assumes that all these organs do is make babies, when really I'm finding they're involved in community, obviously pleasure and sex, and regeneration and regrowth, but also female, presumably a certain type of body that has them and that other bodies don't. So honestly, I have my own terms, but I don't know if they're useful for doctors. I use like vagina et al. And vagina and friends. Often I think you could just say like what organs you're talking about. I think pelvic organs is a little bit boring and undescriptive and
Fair.
unhelpful. I know there's a really good argument for, I guess in a more social context, using pussy
Yes.
as like, this is like an affirming, like reclaiming this word, and it kind of like covers all the fun parts on the outside, as I like to call them. So that probably wouldn't work for a doctor.
That's fair.
You tell me.
That is actually really fair. Because I think for me, when I have a patient, I will ask. But I did have, so I'm a family doctor. I've done the full spectrum of care, from prenatal care all the way to the womb to tomb is what we say. And I had a patient who was a trans man who was pregnant and was delivering a baby. And I did find it kind of hard.
But could you say just your uterus and ovaries, or
And you know,
you
that
would have to
uterus,
ask that good one.
right, exactly. Uterus and ovaries was okay, but they didn't like vagina. They didn't like vulva.
Yeah.
And I don't remember what we ended up doing, but that's why I found like that was interesting how you centered those people in these conversations. Like, for example, you were, especially with Aminata and about the female genital cutting, I thought you were very good at centering that cultural experience. So like in terms of that, how were you able to kind of center that cultural experience, even if you're not from that culture?
Yeah, it definitely took a lot. It was very humbling. It took a lot of care, but I realized that throughout history, we have often centered the doctors who kind of were treated as, no offense, as like explorers of a new territory that they were claiming. It was very, very colonialist, the way that the female body was described. And what was really left out was like the trickle down effects of all of these theories and all of these new ways of cutting into the people who were impacted the most. So I always sought to like center the patient perspective first and see what they care about, and then see what the doctor was intending to, I guess. So with genital cutting, it was very difficult because there's a lot of Western assumptions about what it means and what it means to people that have had it. And I knew the only way that I could tell an actual real story was to ask people themselves, and to know that that wouldn't reflect everyone's experience. It's an incredibly diverse practice. One thing I realized as I was researching that chapter was that genital cutting is actually like a very ingrained Western practice, and that we've actually had literal removal, in Europe and America to the 1940s, and a cure for masturbation, and it came out of like the sexual panics of the Victorian age. And it's like, to other an entire culture and say this happens over there is just patently untrue, and really takes away a lot of the context of this is something that happens in a lot of different societies, and we have to ask why and what effect it has on people.
I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because I feel like when I'm discussing with patients of different cultures, and it's or even just like people discussing with me in terms of like what they kind of like how I present, or how like my patients present, because my patients come from many diverse cultural backgrounds, it's really hard not to want to put your value system on them.
Absolutely.
Right. So I think that was really cool that you did that.
Yeah, and so one thing I did, I guess, on a practical sense as a journalist was with these really sensitive and personal stories, I would usually go over the entire story with the person, which is something I've never really done in my reporting. It's like not okay in journalism at like newspapers. But it was very important to me that they not be surprised by how I represented, that they thought it felt true to their experience, and that there was nothing that they actually didn't want in there that they didn't realize at the time. So I spent a lot of time on the phone with people, or even sending them passages. And I learned a lot. Like, I was definitely schooled, definitely by this incredible intersex woman who was like, actually, enlarged clitoris does not reflect my reality. I find this an offensive term, and here's why. So things I had no idea were stigmatizing or problematic. Like, I learned very fast, and I never made the mistake again. It just required a lot of humility and realizing that I'm ingrained with all these same biases.
Yeah.
Because that was my point in that passage, is that we all have blind spots and biases, and I was no different. Like, I definitely learned a lot throughout this.
I think that's really cool too, because even if you come from like, even like as like I'm a woman of color, like I still make mistakes, right? And we do gender affirming care where I work, and I think that the patients are so sweet and so amazing, so patient, you know, kind of like what you're saying. But I did want to move on to and talk about so I from my perspective as a physician, like this book was just really exciting because I'm very passionate about the vagina. So oh my god! So I'm sorry if I keep waxing poetic. I don't really
Like, we could be blushing under the mask. So
yeah, exactly. But like the part of I thought was really exciting was about BV, because I have a lot of patients who I treat with BV, and I was hoping you could talk more about like, because you mentioned that you had BV,
Oh, yeah.
and it sounded terrible, and then you read and kind of wrote about BV, and I kind of wanted to know how that was being on both sides of the coin.
Yeah. So BV, like, I had no idea what this was. It's bacterial vaginosis, and it's like a general ecosystem shift in the vagina, like a very common infection that 1 in 3 women who are premenopausal will get. So it's the most common type of vaginal infection, 1 in 3 women. And I do start the book, the only time I'm in the book, because I really am in the background. The rest of the time, it's really centered on like the doctors, scientists, and women. But I do mention that while I was at Smithsonian, I had a very frustrating and itchy infection. My old Smithsonian editor is here in the crowd. And basically, I ended up being prescribed what my doctor literally said was rat poison. It's called boric acid, and it's been used since the 1800s. So my doctor agrees here. And it kind of like levels out the vagina like a nuclear bomb, apparently, and like kills all the bad things. And then you hope that the good things will come back, but you really don't know what's going to come back. So it's like the most crude and antiquated weapon possible. And you have to take these capsules, put them up your vagina, and then like lay on your back and think about what you've done. Yeah, there was a lot of kind of like weird shame feelings coming up, and I'm like an incredibly shameless person. I like posted the ultrasound picture of my IUD on my Instagram, and I was like, welcome to the world, baby. So it was very new for me to be like, I feel like dirty and like I did something wrong. I don't know what's going on in my body. And then the turn in the story, which is like your mileage may vary, probably other people didn't have this happen, is one night I woke up and it was really late and I realized I had forgot to take my medicine, and they look just like antibiotics, and like, you know where this is going. It's like a plastic. I was holding the bathroom and I was like, oh, just swallow this. And I swallowed vagina poison. Meant for your vagina, not your mouth. It literally said poison on it with a skull and crossbones. It said call poison control. So I ended up in the hospital in the ER. And yeah, as I go into the intro, like that's just when I had this moment where I just felt like I floated out of my body, and I was like, shit, I'm like I'm just like a science writer, and I think I'm all like versed in bodies, and I know a lot about my anatomy, and I talk about my vagina all the time, but I have no idea what I was putting in there. I have no idea why this problem happened, and like I find myself able to talk about it with people, and I feel really isolated and alone, and that just simply can't be the case. So yeah, that's what led me to then. I think I used journalism as an excuse to talk to all the best like BB experts and like get into the vaginal microbiome. I was like, I'm writing an article, which later became a book. So thank you, my vaginal infection. I've gotten a lot of mileage out of it, as my editor tells me. Other people got nothing out there, so I'm very lucky. Oh, that's the clitoris.
I didn't even notice it was there.
She's hiding.
Oh my
She
god.
comes out at the right moment.
Okay, I got some.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
I was like, whoa. Well, I actually, as a physician who has prescribed boric acid, I was horrified. I was like, because you literally like, I actually looked at patients and been like, don't eat this. It's for your vagina. You will die. Like I looked them in the eyes, and you were like someone who, like you were saying, like you're into science. Like anyone can do that accent. I don't know how I'm gonna prescribe this ever again after reading that. Like I was like,
It just like doesn't make, it's just like logical sense. Why can you put it in your vagina but not your mouth? They actually have pretty similar tissues and mucous membranes, but that doesn't make sense. No one explains it to you.
no.
And they look
No.
like pills.
And they look
Yeah.
like
It's very embarrassing to explain this the first time for like many reasons, but one, he's like, I'm such a dork. Like, who does
No,
that?
I agree, but I am going to be like, I don't know. I'm just like real, because so how I
Well-
prescribed it is a powder.
Yeah, not, it wasn't in a pill.
It
was
wasn't in a
powder
pill. Yes, I've had it, and then they mix it, and they put it in his vaginal suppository.
So there should be like the plunger of doom.
Yes, the plunger of doom.
I'm very familiar.
Have you all done the plunger of doom in terms of yeast infections?
Yeah,
Yeah.
we'll make you raise your hand.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we'll make my
Cold,
hands.
uncomfortable feeling. Yeah, we did that.
So that's how I've done it before, but I have also prescribed the pills, but I don't think I can.
Yeah, maybe they wouldn't swallow it that way. I don't know, but I was totally fine. You have to swallow like 2 cups to die apparently. So just so you know, if you ever do have this happen to you, hopefully no one will. Don't panic. You don't need to go to the ER and get charged $300 like I did.
Moral of the story, it's about dose. And everything is about dose.
That is the medical moral of the story.
But I was really excited about that just because I treat it. But also just like the like not grief, but just like the like discomfort and the embarrassment that you're talking about. I just even as a person with a vagina, and even as a physician, like you'd think that as a physician that wouldn't be the case, but we all kind of have that. And I think that it was really cool to kind of see it written. So thanks for including that.
Yeah, I like shame became a huge. I mean, like originally I was like, we should name this book The Shame Parts. And my editor was like, no one wants to read that. She was right. But it just like you could not escape this deep sense, even if it's not like something you believe, it's like coming out of all these messages around you. So the most obvious example was I kept coming across the word pudendum when I was researching the book. And it was like in gynecology textbooks, and then it would show you at the bottom like the derivation of the word, and it would say the parts for which you should be ashamed from Latin or something, and then it would just move on. Like, you can't do that in all anatomy books, and it was only women. And I looked further into that, and actually, it wasn't just this one kind of technical word. It was like every time a dude discovered the clitoris, he would name it the shame part, basically, some version of that. So Hippocrates had a word for it that actually meant male and female genitalia. And then this French anatomist, he called it membre honteux, and that was like the shame member. And you have in German the Schamlippen, which are the labia, and it means the shame lips. So it wasn't just this one word, like someone was a jerk. It was that this idea kept attaching itself to the female body, and that it was shaping how people asked questions and how they viewed female patients. And I just think it's something you have to attend to if you look at this. Like I've literally heard incredible scientists that want to make like a diagnostic test of menstrual blood in order to find all these different diseases or markers of health. And they were told by gynecologists, ew, we're not going to ask our patients for like their menstrual blood. Like that's gross. We can never do that. There's this shame that's like projected from doctors and patients. And I think that's what we need to talk about.
No, I agree with you. And one of the things I also, so like that part about the clitoris and about men discovering the clitoris, I'm just like, all you had to do was like, you mentioned that there was this one part where the midwife must have told, was it Hippocrates?
Yeah,
Or,
he
right?
admitted he'd never looked at a female body. He just
Yeah.
listened to midwives.
All you had to do was ask a woman
Yeah.
with a
He
clitoris.
clearly didn't. but-
Yeah.
Actually, I think he knew where it was, to be fair. I don't want to diss him.
But I found that also kind of like interesting, but also frustrating
Ugh.
because there's all these it's about who gets remembered.
Yeah.
Right. And who gets remembered for discovering the clitoris.
Yeah.
This is a part of the body that anyone with most people with a uterus have. And so we know where it is. Like you could have just asked 50% of the population.
Oh yeah, no, I'm just picturing like all the like women and people with clitorises on Earth in the background rolling their eyes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I get into like these clitoral cat fights where these Italian anatomists in the 15th century was like, I found this thing. I call it like the sweetness of Venus. And if anyone else says they found it, they learned it from me and my students. And like basically like copyright TM. And then you have like the father of anatomy, Vesalius, being like, this is a new and useless part that does not exist in any healthy women. And then they're just like arguing. I'm like, has anyone asked about the population? What was my point there?
No, well, no, I think I think it's just that like who gets to be remembered,
Yes,
right?
point.
Because I think the women who like have actually just like Miriam
Mhm.
and how she's just kind of like pushed to the side after all that work on cells and like who and all those women who even helped with Dr. Sims.
Yeah.
Right. Who helped him kind of like, and they're just not remembered in the same way.
That's right. Yeah, I will say that there was an incredible British midwife named I want to say Jane Eyre, but her name's not Jane Eyre.
Was Charlotte Bronte involved?
But she had this beautiful description of the clitoris in the 1600s as being like, it makes women lustful and passionate, and without it, there would be no desire and no want for sex. And I was like, why didn't anyone listen to her? She was so on it, and like she worked with women's bodies every day. But to the people you mentioned, yeah, that's exactly right. It's like at Smithsonian, I helped do this column that was like on some women in the history of science, and it was half about how these women transformed their field, and then half about the barriers they faced in getting to where they got and being remembered. And I kept coming across very similar stories. And one was Miriam Mencken, who was the first person to achieve IVF in like the basic sense. So combining egg and sperm outside the body in the 1940s during World War II. And nobody knew her name in her field, in the IVF field. She was literally a footnote. And she like had this remarkable life where she worked on the pill as well. She was like technically brilliant at what she did, and nobody else could repeat that for 30 years. So I went to look in like what were the reasons that she didn't make it, and actually it's remarkable that she got as far as she did. Like at that time, women were generally not allowed into Harvard Medical School or any medical school. She basically had to follow her husband around because he kept losing his job and having to go to other states, so she couldn't do her work. And she had to support her kids by herself. Many cultural reasons that she put to the side. And she was almost like of a paper trail, the most archival stuff that I could actually write about. So I can't imagine how many others weren't there. But yeah, she worked under John Rothke, one of the developers of the pill. And he actually made a big effort to get her name in the really big science papers for it. But even that, like, I would talk to like IVF specialists and they'd be like, I have no idea who that is. So,
Well, I think that I also kind of wanted to know, were there, because you mentioned like other people that you didn't get to include in the book necessarily, like you just mentioned that person that you were saying now. Are there any really interesting people that just like couldn't, like you just didn't have space for?
oh my God, so many. I would not even know where to start. I mean, one of them is in the audience, an incredible sexual medicine specialist named Dr. Rachel Rubin. Sorry. And yeah, I met people too late, kind of. I'd spent 3.5, almost 4 years on this book. And by the end, when I understood the landscape better, I was having people pop out at me. I was like, dang it, if I could just go back in time. But one, I actually end with a brief history of intersex rights and these non-consensual surgeries that are performed on any infant who, essentially the way it was explained to me is doctors essentially in the past took out a phallometer, and if the phallus was too long, then they would shape it into a clitoris. If it was too short, then if for what we would consider to be a boy, then they would try to do something else, but usually make it into a girl. So it was this horrible way of instituting the gender binary that was really all about cultural ideals of what men and women should be. But it was shaping people's lives, which is something we talked about a little bit, that this was the most important thing to me, was that it wasn't just that the science is wrong and that it's based on biases and wrong ideas. It's like who really gets hurt the most, and that these aren't just theories, like people's physical bodies are shaped by medicine and science. So I do include have an afterword that really considers what this has meant for both intersex people and trans people in the past who had to really fight to get access to the care they wanted. But I wanted to do so much more on that, and specifically the intersex piece. Or like that's changing really rapidly. Like even now, there's still a fight going on to get rid of these surgeries, which are still happening all over the country. And I felt that that was a really important aspect of how we think of men and women, and the kind of fear and threat that people feel when people don't fit into what they think of as that box.
Right.
So that's something I'm pursuing.
Well, I think that, like, speaking of, like, that's kind of part of some of the larger themes, you know, in the book. Because we were talking about this earlier, like in terms of like, it's not actually all just about the vagina, right? It's also just about like there is a lot of talk about structural racism and the effects of like when you put those definitions on people. And I kind of I like, for me as a physician, I found it very interesting because we were talking about, like, even for kidney transplants or lung transplants, right? Like those categories are placed for people in terms of like what's normal.
Yeah.
And we were talking about that even with the vaginal microbiome, like what's normal. And so if you could talk more about that, that would be cool.
Yeah, so what's normal was this huge theme that came up also about like clitoral anatomy and like sexual experience that people are having. Like, you should have a vaginal orgasm, even though I'm Freud and I've never studied the female body. So the vaginal microbiome was really interesting. I became obsessed with it because of my own experience, which I shared with you all. We're all now best friends. And it's like this teeny ecosystem that's like another planet that like keeps itself in balance and protects you, and it's between this, like, it's between you and not you, and it's really an extension of your immune system. And there's just like so much going on down there. It's awesome. But I was like, okay, this like microbiome science is really hot. I reporter like got a whole book on it. Like, people are going to be really into this, right? And when I talked to researchers, they said, well, at first there's the ick factor. People don't want to think about bugs in the vagina. And then there's the no one cares about women's problems or women's sexual health problem. So it's this compounded issue. And like, yeah, that sounds really harsh, but I was told it enough times that it seems to be the case. So people would go up to like venture capitalists and startup pros, and they would literally walk away from them when I started to pitch like, we should try terraforming the vagina or helping vaginal microbiome protect itself, or just looking at this. So there has been, the research was delayed, I think, past the gut microbiome, but we do now have more than 10 years of research on vaginal microbiomes. And the problem, as one researcher was telling me, is that there's kind of this implicit idea that a healthy microbiome is a white woman's vagina, and that anything else is kind of a deviation, not the norm. We have to ask why it looks different, even if the person has no symptoms and is perfectly healthy. And we haven't looked at like what's normal for everyone. So that researcher who's in there, she's actually like a nurse PhD, and it was kind of this, and she's a woman of color who's like treated this many, many times. And so she was able to see, I think, what a lot of people couldn't, which was that whenever people saw a difference, they assumed that it was race and it was biological, because there's just something that makes you go there. And she was like, well, have you also looked at all of the societal influences, the influence of living a life under racism, having less access to healthcare, having like a different, like worse access to nutrition, like, and she kind of exposed that this is a very harmful bias and tendency to categorize things as like, why do we have to put it into like race boxes? And if you centered those populations or studied more of them, you would have a wide variety of what is normal probably, and you would have different medications and ways to treat it rather than making everyone's vagina look the same, which is what a lot of things do. And hopefully you would have something less barbaric, as she put it, than boric acid, aka rat poison.
I I think that I know it's so sad that that's, I mean, admittedly, that's kind of like the last resort, like you were
Yeah,
saying
they
in the book.
they're like, we're not sure it's gonna work, but
But it's more common than you think. I've had so many patients where you're just treating them over and over again, and it's really frustrating.
yeah, it's very.
I also wanted to ask about, because when you talk about vaginas, you know, for most people with uteruses, the time they think about their vagina is when they're having a baby, right? Like during pregnancy, during childbirth. Okay, maybe just
Wait,
maybe there's just
uterus is, yeah.
Yes.
I think about vagina all the time. but
That's
I'm not
fair.
a
That's
good-
fair.
I'm
Okay,
not
that's
a good-
a, I guess I have a biased view because it's like because I took care of pregnant women.
That's
for
why
so
I like that
long.
we're in conversation though. That's
Yeah.
why this is great. We're kind of two different
Yeah, you have this perspective.
focuses.
Yes. So like what I guess for me, like I was wondering why that focus, like because I've seen a lot of effects on the vagina during pregnancy. You don't even have to have a vaginal delivery.
Yeah.
Right. And I was wondering if in your research you kind of looked at that or saw any of that. And was it just kind of a focus you couldn't include due to time or
Right. So I actually I assume that this book would include a lot about pregnancy and childbirth. And like, yeah, we all know it's a biological miracle to create a freaking human and a whole new organ, the only temporary organ in the human body, the placenta. And like, did you know that mothers of boys often have XY neurons because
Mhm.
fetal cells make their way up to their brain and turned into, they were stem cells that turned into brain cells? Wild. Yeah, we contain multitudes. So there both was and wasn't an incredible amount of information on pregnancy and childbirth. So I guess the real reason is that I realized that there was this huge bias towards fertility in medicine, and almost all like science of the female body is geared towards fertility and reproduction, to the point that we didn't even have a branch of the NIH that was about vulvas, vaginas, and uteruses and their general health until 2014, and it's still part of the Institute of Child Health and Development, which makes no sense. So like these organs are with us our entire lives, whereas we're probably usually pregnant like I can't tell you how many months the average person is pregnant, but it's a very tiny portion of your life. And and what anatomists have called them, they are also these hormone producing factories that support the health of pretty much every body system. And they're in this feedback loop with the brain constantly, like helping with like heart health and cognitive health. And they're not just a reproductive organ at all. They're an organ that's deeply interconnected with the rest of the body. And so when I started seeing this bias, I think I decided to focus on what I thought was less cared about and less studied, and seeing that sexuality, pleasure, female sexual health was so like left in the dust. I was like, I want to fill in these gaps and introduce this to the conversation.
right, like more ignored.
Or what?
More ignored.
Yes,
Like that,
yes.
that's not as like
Sorry.
especially no, it's okay. Like when you're looking at what actually get to be in the discussion.
Yeah, and there are quite incredible books on pregnancy and childbirth, and I think that is a huge category, but I didn't see the book that I wanted to read about the
Yeah.
body that I cared about and inhabited,
Mhm.
and someone who like doesn't really know how they feel about kids, but wants to understand my body during the whole rest of my life.
Right.
I actually did a lot of research into what happens to the vagina during pregnancy and childbirth, and correct me if I'm wrong, but essentially everyone I talked to was like, well, I don't know. Like literally there was a book called The Vulva and Conditions and stuff. And it said, yeah, usually the vagina like bounces back after 6 months or something. And I went and called the author of that book. I was like, how do we know this? Where's the data? I don't see a citation. And she was like, yeah, that's just like clinical observation. Like we just kind of guessed that. Like no one done studies. And I had so many questions about it, because I mean, a lot of people I know have so much insecurity and feelings of shame and wonder if the vagina is tight enough and all these horrible things.
Right.
And why don't we have a baseline of what's normal variation that could at least assure people like this is totally normal. Your body's supposed to do this. Also, like just push out a baby. It's not going to be the same. And just showed that generally that part of the body is extremely resilient,
Yes,
like given what
yeah.
it does. And so actually the chapter on vaginas was the hardest to find what I was going to write about because there was so little information on the baseline info about the vagina. So I ended up writing about a duck vagina researcher because there was more information on animal vaginas.
I feel like I now know more about duck vaginas
Than you ever wanted to or needed to know.
than I ever thought I would
Wonder of
as
nature.
a human physician.
I'm so glad I brought that to you.
Can't wait to go talk to my friends about that.
Super useful in all your patient evaluations.
Exactly. But I also like the thing is in terms of like even with menopause, you know,
Yes.
that so much changes. And I actually don't have a whole lot that I can do for patients. Like when they have there's only really one thing that you can do for patients. Like you give vaginal estrogen. So you give some of that estrogen back that the ovaries aren't making anymore.
Right.
And that's really the only thing you can do. And you worry about people who've had breast cancer or endometrial cancer because they're like, oh, I don't know, should I give this or that's really all I have.
I have a hormone expert in the audience.
I
I've got a lot on this actually. But I think you bring up a good point, which is I think it's really we haven't asked these questions historically because like the doctors don't always care about people in menopause because they've already had their kids and they've performed
done
their
with them.
function.
Yeah, we're done.
So then as a result, you have doctors that are trying to care for these people and they don't have as many tools and they therefore are not going to be able to offer as much and they don't want to say just like, I don't know. So they're going to give you whatever they have in the way that Viagra became like universally prescribed because we had the tool to fit the job, thanks to pharma. So I guess it's a chicken and egg. It's like there's a lack of care and a lack of taking these problems seriously that then leads to a lack of tools, which also makes it difficult to care for people, which probably all feeds into this terrible cycle.
Well, it's real. It's like in terms of like ED, for example, like erectile dysfunction has so much research and so much money behind it. But then, like, I need a medication for BV that is not rat poison
Vaginas or whatever.
or any of the things.
And in order to have that, we need to be able to talk about that as like both a society and within medicine and science and have people not laugh or walk out of the room and say this is something worth studying and investing money in. And so like that I think is the really hard shift.
Yeah, I mean, I was so I was like part funny, but also like really sad when the researcher who was studying duck penises and duck vaginas like got into that whole controversy.
Oh, you mean when Fox News called her out? They were like, "This is where your taxpayer dollars were going for duck penis studies." And she's like, "I'm a basic scientist. I studied the anatomy. I studied sexual evolution. Like, this is how it goes. This is what science is." So I have to explain that, and they were like, wildly inappropriate. Like, who would do this? But she's overcome that quite easily. She's become this huge voice for like, why are you studying male animals of all these species and never looking at the female? You literally describe the vagina based on as like an extrapolation of the penis instead of looking at it. So she was the first person to do a full exam of a vagina. Or I say exam, but this was a dissection. And she described it as like peeling off the layers of tissue, like opening the present. And she loves this work. So not like a pap smear of the duck. But
Can you talk about vagina lollipops?
did I mention?
You did in the book.
Oh my god. Specialist, and we dissect snakes and make lollipops out of their vaginas with her. That's what I call them. And they have two vaginas, most snakes. There are two penises that also go in there. And so what she does is she inserts sex into the vagina, lets it harden, and she puts like a toothpick in as like this. But one is there's think of this as a negative space or a lack or a cave to be inhabited. The word vagina means a sheath, so it implies that there's a sword to put in it. But really, like, this is a remarkable shape on its own that actually has many permutations, and it has like muscles and collagen and is really doing its own thing and protecting you from infections for most of your life. And looking at this small vagina lollipop just made me appreciate vaginas in all their glory.
I had to, that was so amazing. I was like,
It's a
oh,
great experience.
vagina lollipops. I think that other, like in terms of being a medical educator too, like you're right, like in terms of like how we see the vagina and how we're taught about the vagina, and even how we're taught about, like you were talking about embryology and a male fetus and a female fetus, and how like the homologous organs. And I think it was really interesting how you talked about that and kind of like how in medical school, if you could talk a little bit about that and what you learned.
Yeah, I think anatomy and medicine are both fields that are strongly based on the gender binary, and things are definitely changing now. But having taken a bunch of anatomy and reproductive bio classes, fetus starts out like with no sex, and then it goes along one of these paths, and the male path is default. Or sorry, excuse me. The male path is what happens when you have an SRY gene part of the Y chromosome, and the female is the default that happens when you don't have that. And they just diverge into completely different forms, and you end up male or female. And the reality was, like, I see it so differently now. I see it as at 6 weeks old, you're like floating, and you have the potential to be anything. You have just like this nub between your legs, which could turn into the penis or clitoris. And you also have two sets of plumbing, basically, like what's considered male or female. And it's not, there's not a default, like the default setting on the iPhone. Like there's all these active chromosomal factors that we don't know as well in the female, but that they've been found that help develop ovaries. And so like through a complex hormone situation, you do have a differentiation into clitoris, vagina, ovaries, etc. But it's all the same parts, it's the same tissues, and like those similarities go on into adulthood. So all the same erectile tissues, and perfect. In the
Good
clitoris.
segue.
Nice try. Job us. So here you have the but the rest of it, as you can see, is like 9 organ, and those are all the same exact erectile tissues as are in the penis. They're just splayed out differently. In the penis, there's 2 columns and then another different erectile tissue. So I like to think of it as burritos and tacos, like same ingredients, different confirmations. And like that was mind blowing to me. It's not that we diverge into separate things. Like we have so many more similarities and differences. We share this universal body plan. Some people like to say we all start out female, but I don't think of it that way. And the other like wild detail I found was that in adults, you actually have parts of those like tubing from the other sex in you. So males have a prostatic utricle, which is like a tiny uterus in their urethra, and women have little dangling.
That's enough for ducks.
Oh thank God.
Yeah, I was like, don't worry, I got you.
And like apparently they're really annoying when they're doing surgeries around ovaries. But you have like remnants, and you have all the same body parts essentially. So it's just crazy to separate the world out this way. And I met so many people who had just like beautiful different permutations of all the body parts we're talking about. And like it's just so wrong and so limiting to slice it up that way.
Right. And I would like to teach everyone today the word vestigial. Yes, vestigial. It's one of those words that I read a lot but don't necessarily say.
Oh my God, that's every word for me.
I know.
I used to say epitome until I was like 16.
For me, it was RSVP. It was really hard.
But like it was. Maybe go other way.
Vestigial or vestigial or. Anyway, that word is like when we're talking about those organs that you're saying that we don't use anymore, that's what we call them, like vestigial or vestigial, because they're not used anymore, but they're remnants. And I always thought that was a cool word. So hello, everyone, look that up. But I think that this idea of like what is female and what is male and that spectrum, like it's something I think we're all grappling with, like you were saying earlier today. Like even right now, we're all trying to figure out what does it mean to be, and who gets to say what it is.
And it was really interesting because this cultural conversation was happening while I was writing the book, where we were starting to talk about like everyone who falls outside the gender binary, and like we need a gender binary, and maybe we need to undermine this. But then I was talking to scientists, and they were saying biologically this does not make sense. This does not cover like the variety of people. And one good example is hormones. So I go into the history of how estrogen became like the female sex hormone. It derives from estrus, which is when animals are in heat, and it means like a mad frenzied passion, like you've been stung by a fly essentially. And so by finding this was involved in ovulation and menstruation, doctors labeled it as the female hormone, and they began to use it for menopause patients and eventually for gender affirming care, because they were like, this is the female essence, so you just put more of this in, and it makes someone more female. And then testosterone likewise became the male hormone associated with aggression and all these things. And they totally, that stopped them from realizing that testosterone is incredibly important in female bodies and vice versa. Testosterone actually takes part in ovulation, and I think has to do with some brain stuff, but like it's not a male or female hormone. Like they're doing important and crucial things in every type of body. They're more like, I was told, kind of growth hormones. They have so many different functions, and they're such like an expansive molecule that it's very limiting to look at that way. It limits, again, the kind of questions you ask and how you use this. So even something that you might take for granted is like, this is a sex hormone, this is a female hormone, this gives me a level of whatever. I think we need to question now.
Well, I think we've talked for a while actually. How are we?
Lost track of
I know. I keep talking.
one more.
Are we okay? So I think I want to talk about that a little more because I think that it is. So it's really like when I look, even just looking at values. So when I'm treating someone and I need to look like your period's having a problem, so I'll look at their estrogen levels, or when I'm looking at, or I'll look at the testosterone level. It's like everyone has the hormones. It's just it's all about the spectrum of how much for that particular person, and if they're happy with the outcome.
Yeah.
So like I want to go back to like Aisa, and I don't know how to say your name. I'm sorry if I say that wrong. AISSA. Aisa and Aminata, because I thought that's like, I think I want to end with that question, because for me that was the most powerful thing that I read, that they were the two women that had female genital cutting, and they had a procedure done. So I was wondering, like when they took back their bodies, like I was hoping to talk more about that and kind of like what that meant to them.
Yeah, absolutely. I shadowed in the House of Women Without Terrors, and it was basically this OBGYN who was an immigrant from Lebanon found that all of these women had cutting, even it could be their clitoris or their labia, but they only found out when they were delivering babies, and she noticed and told them. And so she was like, I need to have a house that, or not a house, but like a facility that takes care of these women in every way possible, like sexual therapists and like family medicine doctors and even surgeons. And she is one of the surgeons in France who does this procedure that is, I think they call it like clitoral reconstruction. And the idea is that because we know, this is so like controversial, so many caveats, but because we know that most of the clitoral tissue is under the hood, so to speak, it's not like you've lost your clitoris if you've had the top off. It's that they can bring some of the other tissue up and expose it. And out this model of the clitoris and say, you haven't lost this organ, it's not gone, you haven't been mutilated, like it's all within you, you didn't know the shape. And for a lot of people, that was enough. That and going to therapy and going through other steps of the process helped them come to a new understanding of their body and realize that they weren't broken or like needing something else to be fulfilled just because society told them so. And other people did do the surgery, and for them it really did feel like a reclaiming. And the words that they always use were like, I want to be whole again, I want my identity back, and I want to feel like a woman again. And I think what's murky is is pulling apart what made them feel that way, what makes any of us feel that way. But for them, it was a really empowering decision to say this was my decision, because in the case of the woman I talked to, they didn't have a choice in the matter. And so they wanted to be the ones who had the final say over their body. And so some people were really happy with it and like went on to do midwife care themselves for other women that have this.
It was cool to see how they got to choose for themselves and how it looked for them, and how the surgeon actually kind of based success based on if the patient was happy with how their body was.
Yes, and I think that of gender affirmation surgery, that was really central to the book.
Right.
And history of like the early surgeons doing this, so making what they call neo-vaginas, they were like, it's so crude, but this is literally what surgeons told me. Like, basically, if it's a hole that a male can ejaculate into, then we've succeeded. We're trying to have like feminine women that go on to be married and heterosexual, and that was the goal. And we passed, and then we succeeded. And just looking today, like talking to the surgeons I talked to, including one who was trans woman herself, it was just the goal was like for the patient to feel embodied and feel pleasure from their anatomy and enjoy the way they look in the mirror and feel. And it was like this complete 180 about why we're doing these things. And so I just think it really showed, again, the effect of what happens when you slot people into a cultural idea of men and women.
Back on here. Like, what is a well,
Some questions.
I was like, do we have any questions? Thank you so much, by the way. That was fun.
No, thank you.
Does anyone have any questions? Do you want to call people? Should I go call people?
You got the mic. That's
Okay, I got the mic, so I have the power.
Thanks so much for being here. This is really great. I dealt with like a lot of I guess challenges in this research, but I was just wondering if you could tell us something that you stumbled upon that was fun, like a happy vagina et al. Fact. What's your favorite?
Oh my gosh, we're like super dark. Oh no.
No, this is super informative and wonderful. Do you have like a favorite happy fact?
Oh, I love that question so much. I've never gotten that question. I'm not struggling to
I
think.
don't love the pause.
I just like, I mean, the clitoris always makes me extremely happy. I love her. The happy vagina. It's just, I'm sorry, I hadn't thought about this very much. I mean, I loved, again, thinking of the vaginal microbiome as like people viewed it as like an army before, but it's more like a garden where it's not whether the microbes are good or bad, it's just the correct balance. You can have some weeds in the garden, totally fine, but it's just its own world, just like protecting you. I like that. I'll think of some more, I promise.
Well,
I feel like I failed that.
I loved that the clitoris has so much to it. I mean, it's not about vaginas, but
Well, it is. Because the clitoris and vagina are really inextricable, and a lot of people throughout history, including Freud, have tried to separate it out and say like there's this huge trend of like trying to break women's bodies into all these little pieces and say this is part of the vagina, this is part of the clitoris, and they're separate. But really, like today, scientists are saying this is all part of a greater whole. It's all completely interconnected. You can't talk about the clitoris without talking about the urethra, the vagina, and the vulva, because it really like reaches into the entire pelvis and it wraps around the vagina and the urethra. And if you start looking at women as full beings that are already complete and not broken or separated, then the picture totally changes and you're able to make connections that you couldn't before.
thanks for that question.
Stumped me.
Thanks for being here. This is awesome.
Thank you for being here.
I was wondering if all the research you've done, has it changed the way that you engage with the medical system and medical care, or the way that you advise other people, friends, colleagues, family, whatever, to engage with it or like advocate for themselves with it?
Yeah, it's definitely made me want to be a lot more active in my care and ask more questions, because I literally was told this is rat poison. I was like, okay. And I was like, this doesn't sound great. I'm not going to talk about this with people, but I'm going to put it in my vagina. So yeah, I have learned a lot more about so many people I've talked to that have had like endometriosis, for example, have found it extremely helpful to have a trusted person with them that is a little bit like separated. So they don't get like clammed up, because it's really hard to have that authority differential and to have them have like a set of questions that they want to get answered at their appointments. And my friend and I were thinking about this, and we were like, it's kind of like a medical doula, but not for birth, where their job is to kind of really make sure the patient gets this experience that they want out of this, and to be there when the patient can't express their needs how they want to. So that made a lot of sense to me. I haven't done it myself, but I do think I question doctors more. Like literally, that's my job, is like asking questions to doctors. But in my own care as well, like I think I've learned that so much of what I was told or what was kind of common sense to many doctors was wrong. So it's not that I'm gonna challenge every doctor about everything. I'm just gonna ask how we know this and whether there's another way and how much research is on this. Yeah, that's a great question. I do think that we all could be more active in our care, and it's not like it's easy to do. I think we need more resources to do so. Sounds like another book. Thank you.
You may have engendered future books.
How did you come up and land on the title of the book?
Amazing question. Yeah, I had a name before that I was like, this is a great name. This is the book, and it was Lady Anatomy. And for me, it was a play because there was actually like a female anatomist who was called the Lady Anatomist in Italy in the 1600s, and she specifically focused on the male genitals and the eyeball. Super cool. But I also thought it was funny in the way that we're like lady doctors, lady scientists. So I was like, it's tongue in cheek. And then everyone pointed out to me like, hey, it's not inclusive. Putting lady, like you don't read the tongue in cheek part, so it just sounds like it's like only anatomy of ladies. Well, that was wrong. Anyway, so we went back to the drawing board, and this is one of the titles I came up with. And I was really thinking about the camera obscura, which is an early pinhole camera. And it was a really important technological development for photography. It allowed you to like project an image onto a wall that was like pretty good, but it was often upside down, and it was often a lot dimmer and less sharp, and you could only see like this pinhole of a picture. So it's not that the information was bad, it's just that it was very limited, and it was literally a narrow view or a narrow lens. And to me, that was how we've been viewing the vagina at all for all these years. It's not like there's no truth and no science, no information. Like we've learned really useful things and come up with really important medicines and treatments, but it's like taking a picture on your phone with like portrait mode. We've blurred out the whole background, and we've only focused on what we thought was important, which often has been fertility and reproduction. And I wanted to suggest that there's another lens, or that we could open our lens wider. Thanks for asking that.
What does volume 2 look like?
Definitely not a penis book. No offense. Penises are great. I love all genitals equally. There are enough. There are enough. I think I am just really interested in people that continue to be left out of the conversation about like gynecology and women's health, because again of that limiting binary, and I want to follow their stories.
Yeah. And then again, the process of how you came up with the art to match your book, because that really drew me to your book when I first saw it.
Oh, I'm so glad. I'm going to tell the artist Armando that. I'll tell briefly. I'm in love with the artist, so he has a really excellent fiance. But so he happened to illustrate a fertility special in the New York Times that I had a piece in. It was like called "Why Women on the Pill Still Have to Have Their Periods," and like just the style when I opened the paper was this kind of like precise anatomical sketches with these whimsical, really funny flourishes. Like it was like a pill container with two sperm that were kind of like swimming around the egg, like eels, and he'd have this like birds and flowers sprouting out of everything. And it really like matched how I was thinking of the female body. Was like, this is precise and there's a lot to know, but there are still like these mysteries and this wonder and these beautiful passageways that you can go down and discover so much more about. So I basically wooed him until he agreed to do the illustrations for the book. It was a really intense collaboration. I've never had that with an artist. Like we would just have Zooms for hours. Sometimes like an editor would be on it and she'd be like, I gotta get to work. I'm just leaving you guys alone. And he would show me drafts and he was very much like, you are Miss Frizzle and I'm a student and I'm like following you on this journey. So he would, but he like obviously created his own work and he would show me drafts of how he imagined it based on reading my book and looking through the visual cues. And I would say, actually, I'm not comfortable with vagina being something like a cave. I think that is actually a kind of harmful representation that I found throughout history. I think we want to go beyond that and think something else. So that chapter, I mean, I'll show you it, but it's actually, it's very Alice in Wonderland, but it's like a doorknob with all of these intricate, different looking locks. And the focus is not on the key, but on the locks. And it refers to this evolutionary theory of lock and key, where evolutionary biologists were like, genitals evolved so that there would be only one key for one lock and species couldn't intermate. And it was really all about the lock, not the key. So we kind of tried to center the female part there. Sure, thank you. I don't know if you can see it. And oh my gosh, I really love how they turned out. Thank you for noticing that. But we thought of it as trying to literally like build a new world and kind of create a new lexicon for the female body that we didn't see anywhere else. And that could be from a place of wonder, curiosity, and even joy, and not from like fear and the female body as an inverted male or whatever.
Yeah, speaking of that, like you talked about how historically all the words that have named the anatomy and whatnot have been very just like shameful and demeaning and whatnot. And it sounds like with the cover and with your excitement about vagina and what's going on in there, like that you're trying to celebrate, like kind of have a celebration. Have you found that in the more recent medical literature or people that you've spoken to? Do you think there's kind of like a change in the way that the vagina is being talked about, or do you still find that there's traces of the kind of shame discourse?
Absolutely, big question. Also, you just reminded me on the cover, there's actually a flying clitoris that we call the clitorodactyl. And it's an Easter egg, so only you know, but now you'll see it for sure.
Sorry.
Yeah, I know maybe we skewed a little dark in this conversation. I'm not sure, I can't tell anymore, my filter is off. But really this was totally a journey of and towards hope. And each chapter is usually centered around an explorer, an anatomist, a doctor who is reimagining this body part as something that has potential, has like transformation in it, can regenerate and regrow. And so that was the overall impression I was getting from the people I was talking to. And there's absolutely a movement around the vagina and vulva culturally. Like you were just seeing like social media sex ed and vagina shirts, and like the word is out there. It's weird. There's like this dichotomy because I think that there's a celebration in kind of the feminist discourse of all these parts, but I still see as a journalist like a huge amount of stigma and fear when I pitch stories about this. So I've literally had editors say like, this is too colorful, or like we're a family paper, like it's anatomical terms. So I do think that strain of shame exists around it. But I know there are doctors really working to make this like normal anatomy. that creates a lot of joy and pleasure and happiness, like Dr. Rubin. And that gives me a lot of hope.
Are there scientific advancements that may be helpful, like things of
I love it.
birth control or other?
Yeah, I was just getting all like gooey over there. Thank you for bringing me back to earth. I'm a science journalist. Yeah. So the vaginal microbiome stuff, there were some really cool researchers that are actually doing vaginal microbiome transplant clinical trials, and like they face a lot of hurdles, but they're doing them now, and they're really promising for learning like what factors do make a healthy ecosystem. How do you reliably shift this towards more health and more protection? And so they're on that journey to finding successful like vaginal probiotics that aren't snake oil, for instance. In the endometriosis chapter on the uterus, there's a incredible who kind of turned her skills with creating organs out of cells to looking at the uterus and this regenerative organ. And she kind of said, this disease and this organ are not just involved in reproduction hormones, they're part of a larger immune system and an inflammatory response. And if we look at those things, there are different forms of treatment that we can explore that aren't just cutting it out, adding hormones, or getting pregnant. For instance, one doctor suggested, and this was just a suggestion, like rheumatoid arthritis drugs, lower inflammation. And if you had something to that effect early on, maybe you could prevent the spread of something like this. And so they haven't found exactly what yet, but they are now looking in the right direction. It's like they were walking the wrong way, and Google Maps had it updated, and now they're at least heading there. So I have a lot of hope there. Those are a couple of them. The ovary stuff was really mind-blowing to me. I talked to biologists who found that human women have the ability to produce more eggs. They have stem cells in the ovaries that seem to be able to produce more eggs. They haven't seen it like inside the body, but they've been working on this. And their idea is to delay menopause for a lot of different situations, including like cancer patients who have like gone into early menopause. But to me, almost what's more interesting is it changes how we think of what menopause is. It forces us to question how ovaries work, that they don't just degenerate over time until they like wither away. They're actually still producing hormones after menopause. Like they're still doing something. And they have stem cells in them. And like exploring that better would help us have a basic understanding of these organs that are important to so many people throughout the lifespan and to pregnancy and fertility. So I'm really excited to follow where those kind of avenues go.
I've also just seen that just in the past couple of years, like there's so many new interesting types of birth control, like that there are people kind of researching that and coming up with new medications. So every year there's like new interesting things that I get to like suggest to my patients. So people are, it's really cool. People are kind of looking at that.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a very big femtech world now.
Mhm.
I get a lot of emails from that, and like, the questions and the problems that they're addressing are really important. I don't know about how they're going about it.
I just get to deal with
The fun part.
I get to deal with the actually helping use it side, but I think the actually researching it side is amazing too. Sorry.
No.
I was curious, just knowing Roe just
I was
happened.
kind of shaking. That's like one thing we have.
Yeah, I don't know how to word this question, but like what, yeah, like, I don't know if this comes up in your book or if this was like a thing for volume 2 or
Yeah.
history, anywhere you want to go with it.
No, it's so weird. I was totally thinking that in my head and you asked the exact question. Thank you. Maybe it's on a lot of our minds. When Roe happened, like, I mean, it was horrifying for so many reasons, but I was like, there's something being left out of the conversation here when we're immediately talking about reproductive rights. Like there's that word again that I find to often limit the scope of how we think about things, which is incredibly important in this time. And yes, definitely the thing to be centered, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I did a podcast interview the other week, and the host was like, I've never shared this with anyone, but I'm getting a surgery, a hysterectomy. And she decided to share it publicly, otherwise I wouldn't. And she'd recently had a DNC, which is a dilation of curettage procedure associated with abortion, to check her uterus for cancer. It was to biopsy it before they did that. And she found out she needed a hysterectomy the same week that Roe was announced, that it was leaked. And that really prompted me to ask, like, obviously abortion care is inextricable from women's health care or just like gynecology. So who are all the people that we can't think of when we only think of reproduction? And I had an article this week in Slate that was basically by taking away tools, like very common ones like misoprostol, which helps dilate the cervix, or procedures like the DNC, which are about learning to get comfortable with the cervix and uterus, you're actually making it harder to treat all of these people that, like the ones I've talked to, that have these chronic reproductive illnesses, endometriosis, fibroids, uterine cancers, people that are just trying to live their lives, who have never thought about pregnancy or who can't get pregnant or who are postmenopausal, but like they still need this care and they still need these tools. And but that was what I really hoped to add to the conversation, was that this matters so much for mothers, pregnant people, people that can't become pregnant, but it also matters for people who have this anatomy and need care for the cervix, uterus, ovaries.
I mean, I have to say something because I'm like,
Yeah.
but like I totally agree with you. We use those medicines for so many other things outside of reproduction. I mean, even methotrexate, which can be used, right, is a medication that people use for rheumatoid arthritis and other rheumatologic diseases. And that medication is so important to help people live their lives. It has nothing to do with reproduction, and yet people can't get it because it's used.
Right.
It can be used as an abortion.
Yeah, and I guess I should probably give a little context that these medicines are not like outlawed anywhere, but especially in red states, like there's now this stigma and fear of criminality attached to them. And there's a fear of getting in trouble using them. And there's a lot of stories about like pharmacists refusing to fill these prescriptions. So I talked to one doctor who's trying to do like a fibroid surgery and use misoprostol, and the pharmacist was like, you shouldn't use this, and like really harass the woman who was getting it, who was 65 or 70.
Yeah, it's not even just about, you're right, like things being illegal, but the downstream effects that you're saying that aren't intended, that people don't realize.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Is that yeah, any of these decisions, it's gonna just ripple out. And I think people are looking at all of these corners of everyone that could be affected that you didn't expect, like immune patients. So that's good, I guess. It's a
We
hard
went
time.
dark again. I know.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
I know.
Someone else can ask another question.
Happy vagina facts, Rachel. Happy vaginas.
I'm curious, when I was reading it, I kept thinking how great it is to read now, but how much I would have loved to have had this when I was like 14. And I'm curious if you've done any work with schools or how you
I would love to. That's my dream. I really am into the Miss Frizzle thing, as you can see. And actually, the reason I chose my editor at Publishing House partly was she was like, we just started a youth section. We should totally do like the kids version of this. And I was like, yeah, lady, you want to do like the graphic novel version of this vagina book? Hell yeah. So, okay. I think my main thought here, which I would love to talk to schools and youth people about, but haven't yet, is I just kind of see this trend in sex ed as it's delivered to like girls and people with anatomy as really starting, and this is my own experience, and I know things are shifting, so I don't need to like generalize, but it was really like, don't get pregnant, don't get an STD, and by the way, at some point you're going to start bleeding and it's going to be scary and I don't really know how it works, but that's going to happen, so welcome to womanhood. And then on the boys' side, you get a more holistic look. Like, it's not perfect, but you talk about like wet dreams and ejaculation and reproduction and testicles and sperm. And, you know, I think how revolutionary would it be if you started sex ed from a place of, again, curiosity and wonder, and like the things I was learning throughout recording this book, like that my uterine lining regenerates every month, and like no other part of the body does this, and it makes its own blood vessels, and then it tells itself when to slough off, and then woundlessly, scarlessly creates itself again. Or like the ovaries producing hormones that support my whole body. If you started from like, what are all the cool things your body is doing for you as a kid? And also, of course, affirming that your body is yours to do as you please and find pleasure in, and not like shaming kids about it. I think that would just change the game, and that is something I've been thinking about. I think there are really good movements to improve and change sex ed. I think Planned Parenthood has a really good and really inclusive, like non-binary syllabus that they share about, but I don't think it's filtered in most of the US yet. It really means a lot that you're here on a Friday freaking night. This is warms my heart. Heart tentacles? My heart consoles. I was trying to say testicles. Sorry.
Wonderful, everyone.
Thank you.
There you go.
Can you come around with me everywhere? Just like medicalize my.
Explain all the
Disentangle myself from the cyborg arrangement here. Thank you all so much for coming. Please feel free to stick around. Maybe Rachel will be kind enough to sign the book for you if you're grabbing your coffee. Yeah, thank you all for coming out. Wonderful, wonderful event. And thank you both so much for this incredible talk.
I'm sorry.